Do that. We're recording. You guys have seen where the recordings all show up now. You've got that on your on Canvas, right? We were talking on Tuesday about Cézanne as one of the figures in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who's instrumental for the development of modern art. And we really talked about him primarily on a formal level. And by that I mean it's not about what he paints, but how he paints it, right? How he thinks about painting as an activity, how he thinks about his relationship to this two-dimensional object that he's constructing, right? And how he thinks about representation as something that is divorced from objective observation, right? That there does not have to be a direct connection with the finished painted product and the thing that inspired it in the visible world. Right? And how important that is a step toward thinking about where modern art goes, which is a divorce, eventually, between these things. Right? Today we're going to talk about something different. We're going to talk a lot more about subject matter. Right? Style will still enter into it. Formal questions will still enter into it. But we're going to talk more about this. And I've got the wrong PowerPoint going, so hang on a second. This is not what I wanted. I want the other one. Those are the two slides I want to start this with, but they're not not what I thought I was looking for here. So hang on a second here. Those are the first two slides in my next presentation. Class, there we are. See, here's the other presentation. Those are the first two slides, they're just on the other side. Now we're ready to go, okay? So we're going to be talking about a movement called symbolism. And we tend to use the word generically, right? Things are symbolic. We think about symbolism where one thing in a picture stands for an idea or a concept or something else. And we can use that term in any given period, but symbolism as a movement was in fact a defined group of artists in the late 19th century that formed together with a manifesto in 1886, the Symbolist movement. Right? Symbolism. Now, do you know what I mean when I say a manifesto? They sat down and they wrote down their agenda, right? This is why we are binding together. This is what we think art is all about. This is what we're trying to do, right? And in many ways, this is really, I'm trying to think, if this is the first one. The Impressionists didn't have a manifesto, right? Nobody sat down and said, and the group of the Impressionists was all over the map. I'm trying to think if there was an early, this might be the earliest artistic manifesto. But don't quote me on that, right? It just might be. But what we're going to see is that lots of artists from this point forward will write manifestos, right? Artistic groups. This is our agenda. This is what we're trying to do. There might have been a German group in the early 19th century that did this. The Nazarenes might have written one, right? Okay, the Symbolists do, 1886. And as a group, as an artistic group, I guess art club, if you will, they elect the painter on the left, Odilon Redon. The L is elided, right? Odilon Redon is elected as the first president of the Symbolist groups. Right? Now, the real name is not so much the Symbolists as the Society of Independent Artists. They sort of become known as the Symbolists, and I don't mind that term. But that's how they've labeled themselves, the Society of Independent Artists. And that's kind of fascinating for a couple of reasons. 1886 is the last year that the Impressionist group ever showed works together. Okay, that's one thing. There's a coincidence there, right? 1886, the year the Symbolists bond together, is the year the Impressionists more or less break up. Now, the Impressionist group was never really a group in the same sense. They came and they went and so forth, and nobody was in all of their shows. But there were only 8 shows over the course of 12 years, right? From 1874 to 86. And so this coincides with the very last group exhibition. I don't know the degree to which people knew it would be the last one, right? That's one coincidence. The other one is that the Impressionists, when they formed, Their name was the Society of Independent Painters. So it seems really similar in a lot of ways, as if they're saying the legacy is being picked up with us. But what we're going to see when we look at the symbolists is they're doing something totally different. Right? They have really nothing in common insofar as their ideas and their agenda with the Impressionists. Nothing whatsoever. Right? And when we read the manifesto, and I'm not asking you to read it, right? But when you look at the manifesto, you look at the ideas that they're interested in, it's the opposite of Impressionism, right? Impressionism, there's the painting that gave Impressionism its name, right? Impression Sunrise from 1872. The Impressionists were very much about using color, using paint, to try to capture a particular objective moment in time, right? An objective play, a play of light, right? How did light look at that particular moment, right? But it's very objective, right? Even though it seems painterly, sketchy, Monet's attempt is to give you the impression of what it actually looked like at that particular moment. And this is why the Impressionists often will paint the exact same subject multiple times over, was because the subject matter is not so much important. What's important is the changing quality of light, right? The symbolists, on the other hand, are not interested in objectivity, right? What we see with our eyes. They are interested in subjectivity. What happens in your mind? How do you feel? What are your emotions? And less interested in the objective world. Right? When we see the world around us, what is our emotional reaction? How does it affect our thoughts about spiritual qualities, supernatural qualities? They're very much interested in fantasy. Thus turning to mythology, like Pandora, right? You know who Pandora was before she was an app on your phone, right? Opened the box of evil, right? Let evil out into the world. It's an ancient Greek myth, right? Mythologies for them. The Impressionists are not interested in narratives and mythologies and ancient histories. They're interested in the contemporary world and what it looks like, right? So this is very much the opposite of that, right? Fantasy. They're also really interested in dreams, because dreams are so subjective, right? They're so different from the real world, and they really are. The dreams are our reactions to things that happen to us, right? This is why your dreams are so freaking weird. Yeah, it's because what happens is you process everything that happened in the day, and then all of a sudden you're standing knee deep in water, and you don't know why. It's because you looked at a puddle wrong or something like that, right? And it's all subjective and illogical, right, reactions to things. And so the painting style ends up sort of evoking these sort of dreamlike qualities, right? And when we look at Redon's image of Pandora, these flowers sort of grow up around it, but they're not really definable flowers, even though we know that Redon studied horticulture, right? He actually worked as a florist for a while, and he knows his flowers, but he ends up sort of being struck by them, and they become these blasts of color that look almost like, retina burn when you look at the sun or something. They sort of move almost like they move around. So the painting has this really strong sort of metaphysical quality, right? These terms we use: supernatural, super, above, nature, right? And metaphysical means exactly the same thing, right? Meta means above, and physical. They're synonyms for the same thing. They're a very metaphysical approach. And even sort of been looking back at maybe some ancient Greek pottery to get the sense of her face, that reliance on strong outline, but it doesn't look like Greek art at all, right? It's sort of modern treatment on that, right? So emotional, spiritual content, right? Revealed through fantasy, revealed through dreams. What this meant often with the symbolists was that they often embraced and depicted images of evil, images of decadence, images of perversity. Because these are all darker things. They weren't judgmental, right? They blurred the distinction between good and bad, right? Between sin and salvation. And so to put forth Pandora, one of the things Redone does is he often takes frightening subject matter, negative subject matter, and depicts it non-judgmentally, beautifully, right? He turns Pandora, she's the woman that brought sin to the earth, right? She's the one that unleashed evil on the planet. This is not what Redone shows us, right? Redone shows us as a beautiful woman in a beautiful nature, right? It's rendering positive what is ostensibly a negative myth. And this is typical of the symbolists, it's typical of Redone. Okay? As they founded their group in 1886, with Redone at the top, they looked around them and they saw that there were, in fact, quite a few other artists who really fit the mold, who'd already been around. And this is typically the case, right? Whenever we get a manifesto or a new group sort of starting off, launching, we will find that, in fact, it didn't come out of nowhere. And they were very aware of other artists who, right through the Impressionist era, were doing un-Impressionist things. And one of the ones they pointed to as a great proto-symbolist, right, a symbolist before the symbolist movement, was Moreau, Gustave Moreau. And in fact, there's a whole museum in Paris, the Moreau Museum, where you can see these incredible, dreamlike fantasy paintings, right? And so here, The Apparition, one of his most famous works, where there's something sumptuous about symbolist art. That always seems to be sort of overly rich and decadent in its style alone, intricate, right? Sophisticated interplays of colors and shapes, right? So with Redone, it's the flower bed around her feet, and with Moreau, it's the way he scratched into the paint all of that architectural detail around there. And again, like Redone, he's taking a horrific story from the Bible and depicting it non-judgmentally. This is Salome and the head of John the Baptist, right? So she's the woman that danced before King Herod evocatively, and he got so hot under the collar that he said, "I'll give you anything you want." And she said, "Well, then give me the head of John the Baptist. You got him in prison." Knowing that that's the last thing in the world that Herod wanted to do, right? She was just toying with him, right? And so he cuts off the head and it's presented to her, right? Has at a dinner. So here, Moreau doesn't treat it in the biblical sense, where doesn't treat it following the biblical narrative, right? It is not like you usually see somebody coming with a platter and everybody going, "Ew," right? And there's the head on the platter. He treats it as there's the head and dripping, bloody, right? It's appearing to her mystically, right? Supernaturally. And it's almost as if maybe what we're seeing is it's what's going on inside her head as she makes the dance. Is this the moment she tells Herod, "That's what I want"? Or is it something else, right? I mean, it's very mysterious. And this sort of mystery is a hallmark of symbolism, right? As is this idea of focusing on these characters who we now call the femme fatale. You may have heard this term before. It's a famous Velvet Underground song from the late 60s. But it's a term that sort of transcends certainly the history of art. A woman who causes problems, right? The fatal woman, the femme fatale. But the femme fatale is a theme that runs sort of rampant through symbolist art. As they, again, we go back to that theme, as they blur sin and salvation, right? As they blur good and evil and treat them both in a they treat evil as beautifully as they would treat images of purity, right? So certainly Salome is a femme fatale, right? The whole story is around a woman who tempts, right? And equally on the other side is Pandora. Another Redone painting, they're often not literary, right? They often don't make any reference to So, Moreau was a prototype for all of this, but Redon, sometimes they're literary, sometimes they're biblical, sometimes they're just odd, right? And evocative, and meant to transport you from the world you're in into a spiritual realm, right? Where things follow their own internal logic without actually obeying the logic of the objective, observed physical reality around you. And, if we think about paintings anyway, the whole point, I think we talked about this on Tuesday, the whole point of painting anyway is to get you to look at the world differently, think about your existence differently. Redons are doing that by teleporting us, right? Somewhere else entirely, right? Now, Redon is also best known for his printmaking. He's a fantastic printmaker. And he's working in what's called lithograph. We don't really do lithograph here. It's a very difficult process. What you do is you treat a piece of limestone. These days we can do it with aluminum plate as well. But you treat it so that parts of the plate, the surface, reject oil, beads away from it. Or, reject water, beads away from it, right? And parts of it will hold the water. And then you roll water-based or oil-based ink over the top of it, and it hits the dry parts. And then you put a piece of paper on that and you remove it, right? And that gives you this sort of chalky quality, right? The grease pencil look that you see here. And again, look at this. This is an amazing image, right? He loves these circles and eyeballs. And again, I can't tell you at all what this means. And I kind of think that was the point, right? Because if it is indeed subjective, truly subjective, that means there's nothing that Redon is thinking that I share because it's subjective to him. Right? It's unique to Redon. And I remember when I was an undergrad, I really sort of fell in love with Redon. I think they're really powerful, evocative images. And also, he has a terrific way of working circles into his compositions, that the round form as a theme. That I think there's something about that, the egg or the universe, in a round form that he's so good at. Okay, my thing is lagging on me again. Here we go. Right, Cyclops is a monster from Greek mythology, right? And look how he does this cute little thing with his smile, right? But again, that weird. It's cute, but it's also kind of horrifying, isn't it? With all of those eyelashes coming off the top of it, and the way he looks up, and again, to build a composition around the circle is just absolutely phenomenal. We have lots of Redons. I could go on and on, right? But we need to keep moving through the material if I'm going to get anywhere near that list we saw, right? So the deformed polyp, right, floated on the shores. What a great title, right? Again, the titles, like the pictures themselves, are intended to totally get us jarred away from our everyday experience and into something entirely different. One of the more famous artists associated with the Symbolist movement is Gauguin, Paul Gauguin, who began his career with the last Impressionist show in 1886. And as soon as the Symbolist group formed, he started to pal around with them, right? They became some of his most important friends and influences on his life. He began his career kind of late. He was a stockbroker and decided fairly late on, I want to say like he was in his 30s when he finally decided to start painting, right? And he's primarily self-taught, too. I think he's pretty terrific, although he's a creep. We'll find out. There's something about him that's not particularly attractive. And here we see a self-portrait of Gauguin. Very much interested as well in the spiritual, the visionary elements of art. Uses color in a non-representational fashion, but not like Cézanne, right? He in fact divorces it even further from what you might actually see in the world around you, so that the background of this just becomes a big field of red at the top and this big field of yellow at the bottom. And the yellow is so strong that it seems to obscure really even most of his body, to the point where it almost looks like his head's just floating there, right? And then he gives himself a halo, right? And if you think about that idea of a floating head with a halo, is he the apparition? Is he the head of John the Baptist? Presented on a plate of sorts, right? Has he been decapitated by some femme fatale somewhere, right? And then you add into that all these other, I got a great detail. Brace yourselves. Yeah! Right? But it's terrific because I love the way that little bit of paint licks up the highlight in his eye, right? But also I think when you look at this, you realize that even though the face looks like it's relatively naturalistically colored in, right? Far from it. At the same time that he's this martyred saint, right, as part of this self-presentation, there's a lot more to it than that. What's that behind his head on the right? What's hanging down on that branch? Apples, right? What does that immediately bring to mind? Apples. Garden of Eden, right? And he's got a snake in his fingers. So he's this martyred saint on the one hand, and on the other hand, he is the lizard in the Garden of Eden saying, "Hey, here's an apple, eat it." Right? He's the tempter, as well as a potential avenue to salvation. All at exactly the same time. Right? This fits right in with the symbolist ethos. One other thing to point to with this, and with symbolism I have to talk about things that are slightly rude, so I'm sorry if it comes across as just like I want to talk, but it's true. Okay, sign down there, 1889, Pigo. I love that, right? Because way before J-Lo, right? He's Pigo, G-O, right? He's Pigo. And I always thought it was funny. And then my wife, who teaches French, told me, well, you know, P in French is paix, the letter paix. Pego. Pego is a French sailor's slang term for penis. And he knows that, right? Because he speaks French. So he's signing it Dick, right? Or something along those lines, right? Willie. You know, you could choose whatever word you want that way. Only much ruder than that, right? And he signs that way a lot. So this idea of being, on one hand, the saint, on the other hand, the sinner, is part of his cultivated self-image, right? Before I go again. And it fits perfectly with this whole symbolist idea, right? That we've been talking about. And I'm sorry, it's rude. You can't get around it. He applies these same sorts of ideas and stylistic choices to works of art that are set in nature, right? Ours doesn't really seem that way. And so here we see, let's see, first, he's in Paris, right? 1886, he's part of the Impressionist group. He's a young, early artist. He's not young by any means, but he's an early artist in Paris. In 1888, he decides that he doesn't like living in Paris anymore. And one of the things that he's interested in, and again, this fits totally with the symbolist idea. What he doesn't like about Paris is it's too modern. He doesn't like the big modern city. And what he was trying to figure out is there a way of life out there that hasn't been spoiled by the Industrial Revolution, that hasn't been interrupted from its early folk primal roots, right? He wants to go find an unspoiled way of life, right? And his idea is that if he can find that, he can get people who are closer to sort of a root personality. Maybe just back to Eden, you know what I mean? In one way or another. And so he decides that he's going to leave Paris, and he ends up going to Brittany. Okay, so there's Paris. This is Brittany over here, and you can see just from the map that it's really isolated. Like it sticks way out into the ocean. Yeah? I got there this summer. It's terrific. We stayed, Karen and I stayed here for a week, here for 2 weeks. It was fantastic. And in Brittany, one, there's a lot of apples. They're known for their cider, right? So that enters it. But the other thing is that an area where local customs live on. Even today, you can still find women that wear these things today, right? And this is 100 years after Gauguin, right? 30 years after. And in addition to that, Brittany is also a region where you got a lot of this sort of Stonehenge things, stone circles from prehistoric times, right? Or the two rocks up and then here, two rocks up and one across the top, right? Everywhere. So there's something about it that has these vestiges of a lost, mysterious past where spirituality was part of everyday life. Whether it's these women and their local folk customs, or whether it's these mysterious stone circles around. I mean, it's just, and that's why I really loved it when I was there. It's like the churches don't look like Gothic churches are supposed to look like. The sculptures don't look like Renaissance sculptures are supposed to look like. It's really weird, and that's why Gauguin goes there, right? So on the right is a painting. Both of these were made while he was in Britain. Okay. And they're very much influenced by that experience. And the one on the right is probably his most famous painting, right? It's in Edinburgh. It was here once, years ago, shortly after I got here. There was a big Gauguin show. And it was all about how Gauguin is trying to sort of create mythology around himself and around his life. In this particular case, can you see? It's mostly women, right? On the left-hand side, there's a tree that runs diagonally across this strong red ground that looks just like the background of our picture. There's a weirdly placed cow that's way out of scale with anything there. But as we follow this group of women, there's women kneeling, praying, come around, and there's one guy on the far right. That's him. Recognize him? That's Gauguin in the lower right corner. Right? And once you say that, look at the nose. Right? That hook, right? Aquiline nose. And the way he set it up, and the way he talks about this picture, is they're meant to be a group of women who have come out of church, having just heard a sermon by the preacher. The preacher, we assume, again, right? Salvation. And as they come out of church, they've just heard a sermon on the book of Genesis, where they hear about Jacob wrestling with the angel. Where he wrestles with an angel because he's trying to avoid God, what God told him to do, and they wrestle through the night. And they've come out of church and they see, which is a Brittany custom, a wrestling match in the town square. I don't do it anymore, but they did, right? And as they see this thing, they have this collective visionary experience because they've all just heard the sermon, right? So again, it's the idea of the objective world inspiring something that's totally subjective. And instead of seeing the wrestling match, they see Jacob wrestling with the angel. So here they are, inspired by the sermon delivered by Gauguin, to see something that is not really there, to see something different in the world around them. Now, if we think about it, of course, that is exactly what Gauguin does as a painter, right? Because he is now, for you and me, showing us a world where we see things that we don't see in the world that he saw in the first place, right? So his role as a preacher is an analogy for his role as a painter. Right? And then we add into that, stir into that, these weird symbolist ideas. The tree that separates the women from their vision is an apple tree. Right? So again, there's that idea that this visionary experience, which is part of going to church, or inspired by going to church, also has a level of temptation. And some people, and I'm sorry, this is rude, but some people talk about where's the root of that tree? If you trace it down, it would be right at Gauguin's loins. Right? At his pego. Right? So, his works really fall into this general idea, right? This general theme of the symbolist movement. And they're sort of rife with eroticism, luridness, sexual innuendo, sexual undertones and overtones. Now, if we look at the style with these broad, flat expanses of color that are separated often by black outlines, but certainly by outlines, he called it synthetism. That's the word he used for his art. That what it does is it's synthesized right? Objective reality with subjective experience. And that the color was the means by which he did this. Right? The color was the means by which he would translate what we see around us into a subjective experience. There was another term that he used for the style as well, which is these bold fields of color separated by line. It's a French term called, I can never get it out, cloisonnism. It's like seashells by cloisonnism, which comes out of an old medieval term for enamel work, which were called cloisonné enamel, where you build the cells out of metal and you bake the enamel into the cells. And so just as an enameled cross here from the 12th century up in the Walters Art Museum has those fields of green around Christ's arms, the sun and the moon, you'll notice that each of them is surrounded by a bit of metal because that's containing the enamel, right? And if we look back now over to Gauguin, we start to see even the tree has a little bit of that yellow outline around it, and that the tree itself kind of avoids any attempt at modeling in 3 dimensions. You get some of that in the hats of the women. But the ground certainly violates perspective and ends up being fields of color that are ostensibly flat, right? And that was his term. So 2 different terms. Synthetism is this idea of that what is art does, right? It synthesizes what we see with what we feel. The objective world with the metaphysical supernatural world. And cloisonnism as the way in which he applies the paint. Right? So this is one of the major influences on Gauguin, our old medieval enamels. And when we think about being interested in medieval enamels, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because he's looking for something pre-industrial, right? Something old where we were more in touch with our spiritual side. That the industry... And this is something that Gauguin and lots of artists in the late 19th century share, is this idea that the Industrial Revolution removed a connection that we have with something, with our true beings, right? Even Karl Marx, who's interested in modes of production, said kind of something the same way, right? That the Industrial Revolution separated us with something special, or from something special. Another major influence on Gauguin is Japanese woodcut prints. These are beautiful things. Hiroshige. And they started working their way into France on ocean liners that were coming in, and artists were collecting these things and copying them. But one of the things, and Hiroshige is the one we always point to because he's the most sort of sophisticated and beautiful of these Japanese printmakers, is the way in which you've got blocking, you've got flatness, you've got interesting juxtapositions of scale, you've got extraordinarily rich but non-descriptive color, right? Non-objective color. All of these things Gauguin has picked up in one way or another. In fact, this one print even seems like something he might well have been channeling for part of the composition that we see on the right. Van Gogh, who was good friends with Gauguin. In fact, Gauguin is the reason Van Gogh cut off his ear. Just so you know, right? We're not going to go down that story, but Van Gogh painted a copy of this, right? And it appears in the background of some of his other paintings. So this is a well-known print to this group of post-impressionists. Well, Brittany wasn't enough, right? Brittany wasn't weird enough for him. Brittany wasn't primal enough for him. And eventually he moves to Tahiti, 1892. This is where Gauguin's story gets a little bit more creepy. Not that it's not creepy yet, but this is even creepier. He had a wife and 2 kids. She was Danish, from Copenhagen, left them behind in Paris to move to Tahiti, to live among the natives, looking again for something that is primal and unspoiled and rooted in some sort of, what do you want to say, pantheistic spirituality, where people are in contact with the spirits and the beasts and nature in all of its quality. And he's there for about 2 years. He comes back to Paris with like 50 paintings under his arm, right? And he shows them at a big exhibition in Paris, like 1893, 1894. And he shows them only with their Tahitian titles. I don't know how to pronounce Tahitian, right? But it doesn't say words of the devil. It says Parau Navaruino, right? And nobody knows what the hell they're about, right? Nobody has any idea about what these pictures are supposed to be. And of course, Gauguin doesn't really care in the same way that Redon doesn't really care. The point is that we're immersing ourselves in this subjective experience, right? And if he doesn't spell it out for us, then all the better that we don't know. But at the same time, I think we can sort of get the sense of what's going on here. And now that we know the words and what they translate into, words of the devil, what the hell is going on here? Who's the devil? Can you tell? We have two figures in the picture, right? Just two. Which one's the devil? Is the devil there? Are they both hearing the words of the devil? What is let's step back from that as we're thinking about it. When you hear that title, Words of the Devil, what do you think about? Does it remind you of anything at all? What are the words of the devil? Someone says, don't listen to the devil. What do they mean? That's right. The words of the devil inspire you to do bad, to do evil, right? And there's nothing in this picture that suggests anybody's going to do anything evil, I don't think. But, right, so the devil, when he talks to us, tells us to do bad things. There was that scene in Animal House. Does this help? Oh, stop it. Or you maybe seen this other movies where the guy's saying, what am I going to do? And a little devil pop up on one shoulder, a little angel on the other shoulder, right? Well, okay. The words of the devil are always telling you to make the wrong choice, right? And in the Bible, of course, where are the words of the devil most apparent? Garden of Eden again, right? It was the words of the devil that got Eve to do exactly what God had told her and Adam not to do. Don't eat the apple. You see how this fits with the theme that's running through Gauguin's work, right? So the words of the devil are the words of temptation. The words of the devil are the words leading us to sin. And have a very particular resonance in being this Garden of Eden. And if we think about Gauguin's career as a career leading him to Brittany and eventually to Tahiti, looking for the Garden of Eden. He's looking for an original primal existence, right, that he doesn't find in the industrialized city of Paris. He is looking for his own Garden of Eden, right? And these pictures suggest that he's found it somehow in local customs. So the words of the devil evoke this idea that Tahiti is for him Eden. Now, if the words of the devil are here, that means maybe he's found it before sin, right? Because when the words of the devil come, prior to that point, Adam and Eve haven't sinned yet, everything's okay, right? Everything's jake, everything's great. But he introduces it to us, and maybe this is the moment, right? When the words of the devil inspire bad behavior. Now, that said, look at the kneeling figure in the back a little bit more closely. Look at how her face is lit from below, so that you get the lights on the underside of the eyebrow. And then look at her foot. Look at the size of that thing, right? That huge, monstrous claw foot. And the buggy yellow eyes. And the way in which the girl, with her hand on her cheek, sort of looks over her shoulder. You know, this is a standard listening pose, right? Hand at your cheek. It's easy, and often people do, to interpret this as being the devil, the kneeling figure in the background. And the words are what the standing younger woman, right, on the right is hearing. Although Gauguin doesn't lock it down, right, that way. Notice how his interest in unnatural colors has continued. He sees these tropical flowers, right? And they inspire him to give us these shots of red and this weird purple ground, right? They've gone tropical in coloration, but the idea is exactly the same. Her pose, the figure listening on the right, covering up her genitalia with her hand here and across one of her breasts, is sort of an amalgam of two different poses. Eve makes sense. On the left is, in the center is Masaccio, 1420s or so, right? Adam and Eve being kicked out of Eden. And she's covering up her nudity because that's the moment, when they listen to the words of the devil, when they eat the apple, they become aware that they're naked. And all of a sudden, what was once innocent becomes bad, right? So that fits perfectly with what Gauguin is trying to evoke with his image. This woman is an Eve-like figure in her own Garden of Eden, right? At the same time, the pose is really similar to Venus, the goddess of love, who is chaste and pure, right? And Gauguin is melding them together, right? Good and bad, right? Goddess, sinner, all at the same time. Again, it gets ruder. This one's up in Buffalo, Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo. It's a really terrific collection of modern art. The Spirit of the Dead Watching, from roughly the same time period. When he arrived, if Gauguin weren't creepy enough already, ditching his wife and kids back in Paris, right? His poor Danish wife, who probably didn't speak that good of French, right? Leaves him behind. When he gets to Polynesia, to Tahiti, first there's a big French port there, and he never paints it, right? He turns his eyes only toward the natives. And he goes and he sets up a house in the native village, right? And he gets himself sort of accepted there as part of their culture, even though he doesn't speak the language that well, right? He sort of wants to live rough, right? Live with them. And he sets up a house, fills it with paintings, makes carvings around the doors. He calls it the house of sex, the maison jouée, which is not of play, it's of sex. They give him a wife, which was apparently the local custom. And he takes her, and she's like 13, right? And that's her in both of these pictures. And he was her first, right? And in both of them, by the Spirit of the Dead Watching, she looks very much like our satanic figure there. Her bum, bright red, right? Here, with the rag cloth over her groin, adds a little meaning to that, with the idea that Gauguin was her first sexual experience, right? And that even complicates the meaning further, because who is the devil then? If she is Eve who's been tempted, and at the same time she's this young girl who's had her first experience with Gauguin, is Gauguin the devil? Is he the one that spoke the words that brought sin into this Garden of Eden? Is he the serpent that's come there from somewhere else? We saw him already that way, didn't we? With that self-portrait. Holding the snake. Tempting us with the apples. Very complicated, very, very subjective, right? At the same time, embracing both good and evil equally. All of these are hallmarks of the symbolist movement. One last Gauguin, and then we'll look at some other symbolists. I think this is probably his other most famous painting up in Boston. Where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? He went back to Tahiti, right? He'd spent a couple of years there, came back to Paris with some paintings to show, sort of freaked everybody out. They didn't know what to make of them. He goes back to Paris, or goes back to Tahiti, because that's where he wants to live the rest of his life. Moves back in 1895. In 1897, his health is declining. He gets syphilis. Serves him right. Yeah, gets syphilis. Health is on the decline. He gets word from France, by one of the merchant ships that's coming down. His daughter has died. And he tries to kill himself. He drinks arsenic tries to kill himself. Screws it up, right? Just pukes it all up. Gets really sick and sits down to try to paint a last will and testament, right? And that's what this is. Sort of trying to figure out, what is life all about? Where do we come from, right? What are we? Where are we going? In other words, it's basically, why are we here? What is life all about, right? That's what that all sums up to be. And it's a massive picture. Okay. It's a massive picture. There it is in Boston. They borrowed the bathers we saw from Philadelphia a few years back. So they had them side by side as sort of, this is what started modern art, right? Are these two pictures. And you can get a sense of what we've been talking about. How, when artists put up a picture that is 7 by 7 feet or 8 by 4, you better listen, right? They're not doing this as a Saturday dalliance, right? They're making a statement with this picture. So Gauguin is trying to analyze sort of what is life really all about. This is going to be his last big statement. And he again sends this back to Paris to be exhibited with a bunch of other smaller pictures that are snippets of parts of this reworked into individual compositions, with the idea that by pulling them out of the big composition, he can exploit other ideas, right, and emphasize them differently. This is something I think that when I was an artist, I didn't think enough about, like the value in doing something again, because you're going to find something the second time that you didn't see the first time around. And the National Gallery has at least 3 that go with this, right, that were part of that exhibition. And he wrote a letter to try to explain it. And by the way, as a Last Will and Testament, this is one of the few Tahiti pictures that actually has a title in French. So he wanted the title to be understood, unlike Words of the Devil, where it's more subjective. This is straightforward. And it basically says, right, where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going in gold background here in French? So he wants it to be understood, right? And he also writes a letter to try to explain things. And of course, he doesn't want to really explain it because it's subjective, right? But one of the things he says is, and you can probably make this out, if it's where do we come from leading to where are we going, you can see that in one corner of the picture is a baby, lower right, and in the opposite corner is an old lady, right? So if we think about those as themes, then the where do we come from has got to be the baby. And the where are we going has got to be old age. This is about life. And everything fits in between that. But it reads backwards, right? In Western culture, we read left to right. And this picture reads right to left. So already he's kicking us out of our comfort zone, right? So there they are, and all the figures around this, and he's painting often on pieces of burlap sack, because he's broke, right? He's sick, he's broke, he's isolated, he's got some oil paints, but he often will go, the merchant ships will come in and he'll get their burlap sacks, he'll cut them up and sew them together. And so these really nappy fabrics that he has is simply by working with whatever he's got available. And he tries to explain this, and I've got some of it written down, but none of that really matters because it doesn't really make any sense anyway. Right? He does tell us that the baby is where we come from. He doesn't say anything about that cute dog behind her, right? As not a word about what that's all about, right? Let's see, I got to look at my notes here because I don't have it all right. And he says that basically the old lady is where we're going, right? We've already talked about that. He says, what's with a duck, right? But he does say, a strange white bird holding a lizard in its claw represents the futility of words. Yeah, right? Jessie's scrunching up her face. It's like, okay, thanks, Paul. That helps a lot, right? It doesn't. But certainly, if we look at what's going on in the center, who's that person? Who does she represent symbolically? What's she doing? It's Eve. She's picking fruit, right? And she, look at that, she stretches all the way from one edge of the canvas to the other. And she's literally in the center of the composition. She separates where we came from to where we're going. So she's got to be, what are we? Right? And then what are we? Sin. Right? We're original sin. And theologically, that's perfectly acceptable. There's nothing weird about that. Yes, every theologian will tell us we are the inheritors of original sin. Gauguin is saying the same thing, but not necessarily in a straightforward theological manner, right? Yeah, we're sinning is kind of cool, right? And you'll notice that right at her feet is a little kid eating that apple, right? So she's already handed one off to another child. Cute little kitty cats, right? And does he say something about them? All him. 2 cats are near a child. Again, okay, great. Well, at least he doesn't tell us it's the futility of words or something stupid like that, right? But they're cute. There's an independent picture of 3 cats, a Gauguin. I think it's in MoMA, drinking milk. It's the cutest thing in the world. Right? He can still make cute pictures even though he's such a creep. Everything else around that is terribly enigmatic. 2 people. I'm sorry, the light in the museum was straight down that day, but you can see these 2 people that are huddling behind, right? 2 people who dare to think of their destiny. In other words, the people are pondering who they are. He even mentions that the figure in front of them, the crouching figure, he deliberately painted out of scale to violate the perspective, right? On purpose. This is now Gauguin's words. An idol, both arms mysteriously and rhythmically raised, seems to indicate the beyond. But certainly the idea of paganism as part of the world he's trying to evoke is a key idea for him. That's what he's been searching for really all of his life, right? Then we'll leave Gauguin there, right? One of our symbolists, right? So we've seen so far Redon, Moreau is a proto-symbolist, and Gauguin. There was a whole group of artists that sort of spun out of what Gauguin was doing. And it was founded by somebody who went to visit him when he was in Brittany, named Paul Seruzier. And he and Gauguin went painting on the Avon River. Gauguin's home was this town called Pont-Aven. Pont, French for bridge, P-O-N-T-A-V-E-N, the Pont-Aven. A cute little town, right? On a river that leads to the ocean, maybe 5 miles inland from the ocean, right? Mills, right? And he wanted to found an artist colony there. And Seruzier came to visit him, and he was very skeptical about how Gauguin was painting. He didn't get it. He didn't see it. He thought this is really weird, right? The red, all these fields of color. So he and Gauguin went out painting one day up the river to the forest called the Forest of Love, Bois d'Amour, right? And as Seruzier sat down to paint, this painting is pretty small. It's about like this, right? Sat down to paint with his easel on site, looking up the river, so we see the reflection of the river, right? The trees. Gauguin is leaning over his shoulder, telling him sort of some things to do. You know, reject objective color, right? Reject descriptive color. Think of color as how it relates to feeling. Think of color how it relates to emotions. And Seruzier is painting this. And when he gets done, he's amazed at what he's come up with, which is this, right? Where I think if it were in black and white, you could probably read it better, in that there's a house back there, some trees along the bank of a river. And maybe some parts of it are realistically colored, like some of the greens are getting there. And maybe that is the sky reflected in the water down below. But at the same time, it becomes a series of abstract shapes playing across the surface. And when he was done, he looked at it and said, yeah, this is really capturing something that isn't physical, but is in fact supernatural. And he nicknames it the talisman, right? A talisman is a magical object, right? An amulet or something like that. Something, when I was in Istanbul, they were always selling these little glass, the evil eye, right? That can ward off evil. That's a talisman, right? And they kept this work, Seruzier kept this work, and a number of other artists saw it, thinking that it had these sort of quasi-mystical powers, like an idol from Byzantine Europe, right? That it could actually have some sort of presence or power, right? So he began to understand this idea that abstraction can enhance the spiritual qualities of art. And that'll be a theme that we're going to talk about a lot, the relationship between abstraction and spirituality, right? Because what does an abstract painting do? It doesn't tell you about where you are. It directs you to somewhere else. a world where the same rules don't apply, right? A world that's different from your everyday experience. That there is, in fact, a very, very strong connection between abstraction and spirituality. And we'll see a lot of artists pick this idea up. Goes back to Paris, Cerisier does, right? With the talisman under his arm. And he founds an artistic group there, right? Gathers a number of other artists around him. And I don't know why I don't have that up here. Let's see. I don't. They're called the Nabis. Les Nabis. I'll write it up here. It should be on there. Les is obviously French for the. Nabis is the Hebrew and Arabic word for prophet. So they basically are the prophets. Because he's now beginning to understand that what art can do is to transport us away from the world and help us to see beyond time and space, right? Just like a prophet sees beyond the physical world, right? Can see other things. And so he founds this group with a number of other artists back in Paris, including Pierre Bonnard, who I adore. I love Bonnard. And another artist named Vuillard, who we'll look at, formed this group where they begin to investigate 1890, 91, 92. Bonnard lives all the way to 1940. Right? Investigate the spiritual power of art. Right? And seeing art not as objective representation, although Bonnard's is quite objective, but rather seeing art as a way in which they can evoke something mysterious about everyday life. And one of the ways they're going to try and do this, and we begin to see this with this Bonnard, is to try to, like Gauguin did, flatten the surface. So look at the degree with this one. I love this picture, right? It's only recently been on display. I mean, maybe the last 2 years or so, and it feels like now my new favorite Bonnard. So it's his painting studio. There's this easel. He's got a crappy old wooden easel like we used to have, right? But look at the degree to which the painting, has been flattened out by the way he treats those walls, right? Really unvaried. There's some brushstrokes in there, but there's these big, flat panels, right? And even the way in which when it opens up to the world outside, you still have this segmented rectilinear set of images there, which open up to other rectangles behind it, right? So everything becomes this sort of gridded series of rectangles that end up looking like you're looking at a lattice work or a fence, right? You become very aware of how flat it is. And then there's this other thing that we think that's probably his wife. He does this a lot. In the lower right corner where she's been cut off by the frame, right? All you see, and that just adds to the sense of mystery, right? She's this ghostly figure lurking. And as he paints her, it's also not particularly modeled in 3 dimensions. Right? And that's what they're getting directly out of Gauguin's work, is this interest in sort of flatness and a lack of modeling. I'll show you one more before we break, because I love this picture too. Where all of these qualities I'm talking about, right? This is tiny, something like this. Like if I could own a work from Nesgard, this might be one of them, because A, I love dogs, and B, I just love this picture. The mystery of the street, right? It's just this deserted street with a couple of dogs and a wagon, right? But again, just like with the artist's studio, the degree to which the painting becomes a series of flat surfaces, like a jigsaw puzzle, right? Where you've got all of these areas. So the street down below, we can see where the edge of the curb is there behind the dog with the calico coat. I don't know what they call it with the dog, but the multicolored coat. But the painting itself is this buildup of blues and pinks that becomes this big flat curtain of color, right? And the foreground dog with the ears up to the side is also not at all, there's no chiaroscuro here, right? It's not modeled at all. It just becomes this outline shape to the point where he's really, the only way you know it's 3-dimensional is by the sort of the width of that line as it grows. And then we move our way back, and then even though what we're seeing is a street that goes this way and then a building that goes this way, you don't get any sense of that. It just becomes this curtain of shapes that are flat against the surface. Right? And this is typical of the Nabis works because they're asserting that it's not an extension of our reality. They're asserting it has its own internal power logic. Right? We'll look at more Bonnard quickly at the beginning of class on Tuesday. Look at his friend Vuillard and a few other works from the Symbolist movement before we jump into the photos. Right? So have a good long weekend. We'll see you on Tuesday.